Are you tired of failing in Granblue Fantasy with id? Well, today I'm going to show you everything that you need to know about how to play him properly, what to build on him, what weapons are good early game. Let's get into it. Id is one of the unique characters in the game that actually has two forms of skills, and technically speaking, your second form has fixed skills that you're unable to adjust, but they do have their utility and their value. However, at its base, you're unable to alter them. Now, in essence, Id is somewhat of a damage dealer. He does a lot of damage, he's got a really big sword, and if you're familiar with the story, he kind of just beats you up all the time, which is really annoying. However, before we go any further, I would like to preface that this is a damage id guide, and although I definitely see the value, and I've definitely seen a lot of people try and play id as a tank or utility character, there is one pretty glaring issue, and it's the issue that I just mentioned, which is you are kind of fixed on what skills you have when you're in dragon form. So although you may want to play around this skill called Atonement, which again reads that you take damage in place of all allies and you counter based on the damage endured, it's a little bit tough because while you're trying to get back to your form that can spam and maintain this skill, you're kind of sometimes forced and locked into the dragon form instead. But on the topic of skills and exactly what you're going to be doing with this damage id specific playstyle, here's what you need to know. In terms of the way that you play damage id, here's basically how the gameplay loop works. If you read the support skill God Might, which again, I've moved my camera so you can read it, it reads that it allows Dragonborn id to enter God Might once 4 outer segments of the Reside gauge are full, landing combo finishers and link attacks fill segments. Now, a lot of that is basically gibberish, but long story short, the reason why you specifically want to come in and out of dragon form or abuse being in human form while having come straight out of dragon form is because of Versailles Ignition, which reads that it grants Drain and Stout Heart to id and also boosts his damage cap while in God Might. You can see the exact stat, or the exact bonus here, which is 30% damage cap, and if any of you guys are familiar with the damage cap or any of the previous videos or any of the discussions I've had about damage cap in this game, you realize that this is really important. Now again, I'm not going to go too in depth with the sigils quite yet, that's its own entire section, but let's just talk about the skills again, because what you choose for id is actually really important. Now, the reason why I chose Unbound is because it has one of the higher damage multipliers of your skills, and honestly, it's one of your bread and butters when it comes to building gauge and getting to your dragon form. This, plus the fact that a lot of what you have to do on id is animation cancel so you can get to your dragon form quicker, makes the semi-short-ish animation that this has really ideal for specifically going into skill, into cancel with your heavy attack, and building your gauge. Long story short, it's a pretty quick animation, and it does a lot of damage. Now, the next skill that we have here is Regenleave Recidive. Okay, I'm gonna try my best, and if I call it wrong, please don't flame me for it. But this skill is basically a ranged attack, and although certain characters like Lancelot or other characters that have ranged skills while being melee are not always ideal, this one's pretty good. Aside from the fact that sometimes the boss moves away or starts flying, which again, if you're a melee player, you're pretty miserable. This skill is pretty good for a number of reasons. The first being that it's multi-hit, which means that you can apply supplementary damage multiple times. And again, in terms of animation speed, which again is kind of a prevalent or reoccurring theme when it comes to id because you want to get to your dragon form quicker, it's pretty good. Now, in all honesty, I haven't sat down and specifically looked at the exact cooldown of each skill, and honestly, I'm not really sure why it's not already just built in, but the cooldown of this specific skill is actually pretty low, which means that you can kind of spam it. But unlike Unbound, there are actually people that prefer the next skill we'll talk about, which is Scourge, as opposed to this one. At the end of the day, both of the skills do damage and have their use cases, so it kind of comes down to personal preference. This skill does pretty respectable damage, and honestly, if you want to take this instead of Regan Sleeve, that's totally fine. In all honesty, it does kind of feel like the animation is a bit slow. As you can see, even from the preview, it kind of looks like he's locked a little bit into the animation. Ultimately, though, I don't think the damage increase or decrease between the ranged one and this one is that big a deal. But the reason why I mentioned this one specifically after Regan Sleeve is because the other skills are kind of non-negotiable in terms of moving them and, wanting to try other builds, assuming you're going damage. Arcadia is id's utility tax, and kind of similar to how certain characters will take utilities like stuns or freezes, this is your contribution to the team. To be fair, a slow is not quite the same as a glaciate or a paralyze. However, it is pretty substantial, and it does sometimes let you break certain phases or get ahead or make the boss not move so much. But I've seen certain techs where you can use this skill in God Might form or in your human form, transition into the dragon form, and then also use the skill in dragon form. It lets you set up for a brief period where you can do a load of damage, and your teammates will probably appreciate it, assuming that you have things communicated and you're trying to set things up. But as a reminder, this skill doesn't really do any damage. It's pretty much a CC. And as a side note, this is one of the only skills that it has where you can't actually use it to chain into your flurry. So keep that in mind when you're trying to set up your skills or trying to figure out what the best rotation of your skills are. You can't do it with this skill. Okay, now in my opinion, this skill is arguably arguably the most important for id, but also kind of confusing because it's definitely not that straightforward. At face value, what the skill says is that it releases dragon power to instantly enter dragon form. And if you aren't someone that's done a lot of research into id, just like me a couple days ago when I was trying to figure out how to play id, I was like, wow, oh, I get to go into dragon form. Let's just use this at the very start. But wrong. That's actually not what you're supposed to do when it comes to id. If you read the second line of the skill, which it says that you fully restore the Versailles gauge if you activate it while in Godmight. Now, if you recall the class sigil that we talked about, Versailles Soul, it reads that while you're in Godmight form, you basically get super buffed. It's your big buff for damage window. So then the mini game that you have to kind of adhere to is trying to get into Godmight form after coming out of dragon form as quickly as possible. And so, since it says that on the second line, you fully restore the Versailles gauge if activated while in Godmight, this basically means that once you get out of your dragon form and you're starting to do a bunch of damage and you're getting stout heart and you're getting, you know, damage cap increase, you actually want to use this skill to prolong how long you're able to stay as human or Godmight version. And since we already know that Godmight form is the stronger version based off of his sigil, what you actually want to do is use this at the end of your post-dragon and turned into Godmight form in order to stay in it even longer. Now, I apologize because for whatever reason, there is no specific skill section for id's dragon skills, so you'll just kind of have to believe me when I say what I'm saying, but you'll see it for yourself soon enough. The highest damage skill that id has, bar none, is Scourge when you're in dragon form. You've probably seen the skill already, but basically what it is this like sweeping laser beam which does a load of damage. If you aim it properly or if you position yourself really well, you can actually hit the same target multiple times, which makes this really, really strong, especially against bosses. In addition to being a multi-hit, there is a burn that you apply when you land the skill, and ultimately this is the skill you must prioritize, and honestly it's your biggest DPS increase when it comes to your dragon form, so try to make sure that you get the skill out no matter what. Now, normally with human id, we don't actually take never enough, but again, the skills are fixed. Part of the reason why we don't take never enough is because, as you can see here, the animation is super slow and it doesn't really chain too well. But in dragon form, the long animations or the super clunkiness of the skill actually completely gets removed. And ultimately, even in dragon form, it acts as a gap closer. So if you need to, you know, bridge the gap or you don't want to lose uptime on hitting the boss, make sure to use this skill. Side note, the dragon form of Never Enough does pair really well with getting into flurries. And to be clear, guys, the mantra of a couple of melee characters in Granblue Fantasy Relink is to basically just spam your flurry in between your skills and get combo finishers. This is a great character that showcases it. So make sure to use any and all of these skills and combinations in order to get into flurry and do as much damage as possible. Now, I touched on it briefly earlier, but if you have Arcadia, as I had just mentioned, it is still a CC, so you kind of want to pair this alongside your previous slow to get the biggest burst window or to do as much damage or to give as much utility to your team as possible. The only substantial changes that happen to the skill when you go from base id to dragon form is that the range, I believe, is a little bit longer, and it also applies a burn, which is cool. You're stuck with it. It's another CC. Use it. Be helpful to the team. Arcadia and Never Enough were definitely semi-buffed when it comes to the human versus dragon form. Regenleave is actually kind of nerfed, which is kind of annoying, but it's okay because honestly, you're just trying to get back to human form anyways. Long story short, once you enter dragon form, this ranged attack is definitely not as good. You kind of just jump into the sky and start, like, you know, shooting at people, which is cool if you're, you know, a character from Dragon Ball, but since it has the long animation and you want to get back to human form, this is not that good of a skill. Ultimately, if you have to hit a boss like Bahamut or something during certain phases and you're randomly in your dragon form, it's definitely worth doing. But again, since the kind of gameplay loop of id revolves around getting back to human form, this is not very good. Now that we've gotten all the skills out of the way, let's talk about his sigils. Here's basically what my trait setup looks like. I have damage cap at max because obviously everyone wants max damage cap and they want to do as much damage as possible. But unlike with other characters, specifically like my Lancelot guide, I don't have any nimble onslaught, and instead what I chose to go here was guts, potion hoarder, cascade, and quick cooldown alongside most of the other usual suspects when it comes to increasing your damage. Stamina and tyranny are probably the best double combo for increasing damage, and unless if you're doing something really ridiculous on Lancelot like flight over fight, but you're not doing it in this case, there's no real reason for you to have something like Berserker or even to have like Glass Cannon. Now, ultimately, if you want to be him, or if you're the god of the game and you can parry and dodge everything that you want, then by all means, make sure to slot in Glass Cannon. But for me, I find it a little bit more difficult, and that's definitely more of like an advanced playstyle. And in all honesty, I'm not that good at dodging on id, but it definitely is worth noting that Glass Cannon does increase your DPS by quite a lot. Now, if you're curious as to why I have so much quick cooldown and cascade, ultimately, it kind of just comes down to you getting more skills means more uptime, means more forms, swapping means more damage. Now, unfortunately, the extra thing that I have here is Skilled Assault, and I don't really want Skilled Assault. I'll probably change this out for something like, I don't know, Combo Boost, or maybe like I mentioned before, like a Glass Cannon Plus or something. I don't even know if that exists, but maybe I would in the future. And aside from that, I don't even have an Imbue specifically on my weapon right now because I'm trying to find the best build for him. However, getting 25 crit rate, which should land you at about an additional 29% crit rate, is really good. And ultimately, I think what I'm gaining from this is 9 crit rate. So I should be around 80% crit rate after my build is quote unquote done. Scratch that, I can't do math. I forgot about the overmastery. You should basically hit 99 or 100 crit rate depending on what your sigils and stuff are. And it's pretty important, especially since it's pretty straightforward to get crit rate, but that's what I focus on to get a more cohesive or a very damage oriented build. Anyways, when it comes to its masteries, I think most characters in the game, barring maybe a couple of the characters that want stun power, is basically the same as all other DPSs. You would like to have max normal attack, you'd probably like to have max crit rate, you'd probably also like to have max skybound art damage cap, you'd also like to increase the damage cap of your skills. So although I haven't found it on id yet, you can kind of get an idea of what you're looking for. I would probably prioritize normal and then skill damage as your big things to look out for, but ultimately I've also seen arguments for having max crit rate because again, that kind of increases the DPS of all your skills. So if you want to prioritize crit rate, by all means, I understand the thinking behind that. Now, another thing that I've definitely not talked about in the past, but I've heard you guys and I understand, I'll give you a little bit more context, is the weapons when it comes to Granblue Fantasy. Now, again, a lot of these weapons are primarily upgraded and, you're just using this in order to upgrade the masteries or gain the mastery nodes that give you stats. But in case you're wondering which weapon you should be upgrading, here's basically what you can think about. In 99% of cases, you're probably going to be using this funny looking tempura fried stick weapon, which is very cool because it gives you crit rate, it gives you crit damage. But something that you also have to consider is that if you are pre-Sword of Bahamut or if you are pre-endgame weapon, you can actually get a lot of value from upgrading Susano, which not only gains more stats with Awakenings, it also gives you damage cap, I believe, towards the end of the Ascension or the Awakening, which makes this actually the second best weapon in the game behind Sword of Bahamut when it comes to it. I do want to preface though, if you're willing to wait for your Bahamut weapon to drop, it's not really worth it to upgrade this weapon. I don't believe you get anything in all actuality the same way that you would from, unlocking nodes or masteries. But in case you want a little bit more damage or you just like the weapon, definitely consider using Susano or in general the Ascension or first Ascension weapon that you guys have access to before you then get access to the Sword of Bahamut. Now, to be clear, when I talked about the best weapon and the reason why you might use Susano, it's primarily again because you don't have the Sword of Bahamut. But let's just be clear, the crit rate and the crit damage that you get from using the premium sword is really, really worthwhile and helps you reach the damage cap pretty quickly and pretty consistently. So make sure to prioritize getting this weapon, especially before you have access to Awakening with your Susano. And at the end of the day, guys, you have to upgrade all these things anyways, so just use whichever weapon you like. The final thing that I want to talk about when it comes to the weapon, and I kind of forgot this section in the sigil section, are the traits that you get when you upgrade this weapon and kind of the reason why this sword is so strong. Now, aside from the absolutely ridiculous stats that you just gain from, again, awakening this weapon, you do also gain Sigil Booster, which gives you one additional stat to main stats and substats that you have equipped, which is really, really nice. And that's kind of the reason why right now I'm at 69 damage cap instead of 65. And I'm sure I don't really have to explain to you how good the increase in attack and damage cap is, but just remember, guys, you need to be below 45,000 for Catastrophe to work. So you can't just have like an 80,000 HP build and rely on this. Oh, and I mean, honestly, I guess the regen is nice, but 2% of your max health when you basically get one shot means nothing. As a super final note, let's just talk about the Wrightstones or the Imbues. Now, I've seen this topic or this conversation come up 100 times. And again, unless if you're running the hypothetical best in slot build that I've kind of already detailed and talked about in the past, where you need to get 12 trait levels worth of damage cap on a Wrightstone, you need to get damage cap on crit, and you need to get damage cap on your class sigil. Unless you're getting these things, which is really tough and super grindy, and you're just a one specific character main, what you're actually looking for when it comes to Wrightstone is basically traits that you don't have access to or things that you want to increase to level 20. What I mean by that is that if you decide to take something like Guts, you can actually slot in a level 5 Guts in order to hit 20, and then your cooldown goes from 170 seconds or 180 seconds down to 120, which for some people, if you're playing that sort of playstyle with Guts, is kind of nice. If that's not the case though, the only thing that I would kind of focus on when it comes to your Wrightstone is getting something relating to critical hit rate. You could get double crit rate, so that's kind of cool, I guess. And then likely getting something utility related or pretty much anything that you want. Whether that's combo booster, or whether that's stamina, lucky charge, steady focus, any of these things, or whatever you feel like you need to flesh out your build is what you should use. And again, while I'd like to give you like a best in slot, the best in slot is kind of ridiculous and unrealistic, so have fun. And before I get ahead of myself, I did forget to mention that the only way to get out of dragon form is actually to get 4 full combos basically filled out when you're in this form. And the only way to do that is to complete, again, a full flurry combo with this character in dragon form. So that's 1. That's 2. This is 3. And this is 4. Oh, I didn't finish it. Never mind. Oops. Okay, so I'm finally out of dragon form, but yeah, I kind of forgot to mention that part. So I did want to just make mention that this is literally the only way that you can get out of dragon form. And that's pretty important because again, the main playstyle or the main damage window comes from when you're in God Might. So keep that in mind when you're using your skills and you're trying to get back to your main form. So at the end of it all, I have a few things that I want to address because I don't think I quite mentioned it well enough earlier in the skill section. And I kind of just want to keep you in the right direction when it comes to playing it and what you should be keeping an eye out for. First and foremost, make sure to weave all of your damage skills when you're trying to get id into dragon form. And when you're in dragon form, the only way for you to actually get out of dragon form is to complete 4 combos on the enemy. So that means that you have to flurry 4 specific times to get out of the form in order to re-enter your God Might form. And that's kind of the entire point of this whole cycle. So make sure to keep that in mind when you're playing him. And the final tip that I have for you that kind of transcends specifically id, but most characters, is that if you're unable to get a combo finisher, or if you're unable to find the perfect window to use a skill and you end up having to enter ranged form, just keep in mind that sometimes you just want to end up throwing out your skills on cooldown as you can, because if the boss flies away, you're not doing DPS, and especially if you're using Scourge, and that means that you're literally doing no damage at all, aka 0 to the boss during that period. Anyways, guys, that's going to be it for this id guide. I do want to give a special shout out to a lot of the people that have been helping me out when it comes to understanding id, because this is definitely a bit more complex compared to some of the other characters that I've been playing. And that includes the people in the Granblue Fantasy Relink Discord who have definitely been answering some silly questions from me as I'm trying to wrap my head around this. And a few of the people in my community that also have been kind of playtesting and kind of seeing how much damage you could do on dummies and stuff. Long story short, I really appreciate the support from all you guys and my community. Thanks so much, guys. That's going to be it for this video, though, guys. If you enjoyed or if you learned something, make sure to like, comment, turn the notification bell, subscribe. Make sure to join the Discord because a lot of us are just degenerately playing the game. So if you enjoy this sort of content or if you enjoy Granblue stuff, make sure to tune in and find me on the rest of my socials or tune in on stream. Hi, if you guys need help, I help people on stream, by the way. I'll see you guys on the next one. Adios.